the Toronto Star. I'm Rajiv Mudder, and this matters. With less than 2 weeks until the U.S. heads to the polls, it feels as though the news cycle is going into overdrive. From coronavirus to conspiracy theories, for U.S. President Donald Trump, it often feels like the confusion and chaos is part of the point.
I'm the only thing standing between the American dream and total anarchy, madness, and chaos.
He came to power preaching that he was different from career politicians. And as America gears up to vote, that is one of the things he has definitely lived up to. Now, as the incumbent, it seems like he's pulling out all the stops, pushing the Hunter Biden story, talking mail fraud, and even more misinformation. But here's the big question. What if it works? What kind of world lies ahead? Edward Keenan is the Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star. He's here to talk about Trump and his bringing about a more chaotic and turbulent world and what that means for Canada. Ed, I know we've kept you very busy. Thank you so much for joining us again.
No problem, Raju. It's good to talk to you.
Always a pleasure, my friend. So let's just start at something that I think is a bit simplistic, but I think it's a good way to begin before we get into specifics about how Trump is a bringer of chaos. But we have to start from the fact that he came in as an outsider and his whole brand is shaking up these institutions, right? So the American public voted for last time as somebody who would bring some sort of change, right?
He's continuing to spread that message. Just this week, 2 weeks before the election, he tweeted something like, if I don't look like a normal politician, it's because I'm not. That genuinely is what his supporters like about him. I was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania recently, and I said to them, a lot of people in Canada, if you look at the polls and at my email inbox, don't understand how you can still support President Trump because he looks like he's sort of chaotic and obnoxious and outrageous and just stirring everything up. And they kind of laughed a little bit and they said, well, yeah. I mean, that's what we like about him, right? He's not a politician. And so that is the brand. He clearly is a politician, but that is the brand, is that he's a sort of insurgent outsider who's going to turn over all of the apple carts, both in Washington and at the UN and internationally, and he's going to do things differently. On some level, that's what appeals to his supporters. On another level, stomping on those boundaries, shaking things up can be good, but when you break them, you're potentially breaking a lot of other things, like alliances with other countries, like the rules of law that govern your own country, and so on and so forth.
You brought up some of the initials, and I want to get to them right now, because in terms of the new Trump world order, I think the big things that we can point to is a new isolationist America, but one that has withdrawn or criticized from a number of international organizations. You mentioned the UN, the WHO, the World Trade Organization. Let's talk about what Trump has done in those arenas and the effect.
The political class in Washington gutted your factories with horrendous trade deals. Horrible. NAFTA, one of the worst trade deals ever. By the way, World Trade Organization, it made China. China made themselves. They did a good job. But they ripped off our country for years.
Pulling out of NAFTA, like unilaterally forcing the renegotiation of NAFTA is another one. Pulling out of the World Health Organization recently is another one. So we could go through a bunch of examples, but whether you're reading books from people like John Bolton, who worked for Trump, about how this worked inside the White House, or whether you're talking to experts internationally, when you add it up, Trump's foreign policy vision is a transactional might makes right vision, in which the United States prefers, rather than working through international organizations and coalitions, it prefers to deal with the other countries of the world one-on-one and to use its own interests as the stated principle on which it will operate in those interactions. And that is one thing for the United States, but it's a change to the international order, and particularly a relatively small country like Canada is not built in a way, this is what experts say to me, is not built to sort of survive in a schoolyard where the biggest bully gets to dictate all the rules. Our whole international approach has been based partly on leveraging our friendship with the United States, but also on being able to compile a case, like understand what the rules are, understand what evidence is needed to sort of make our case to the international community, and then take that case to the international community and make it. And whether we're talking about trade negotiations or trade disputes, or whether we're talking about the floor of the United Nations, the idea there has been that, like in a court of law in Canada, you kind of make a compelling case that your solution or your proposal best meets the rules and the objectives of this, and other countries will respect that. So we've won trade disputes with the United States in the past, and one person phrased it as kind of like they let us win. And they let us win in the sense that they respected the judgment of an international institution that they helped set up and whatnot, when clearly they have the military might and the economic power to enforce their will if they want to. And the question for Canada is, if we have to deal with the world where major actors like the United States and China and India, potentially in the near future, and the EU will enforce their will, then how do we sort of survive in that, or how do we thrive in that?
As you say it, our foreign influence has basically been directly related to the fact that we're their neighbor. And generally, we've been sometimes either the friendly face or the mediator. Now, obviously, in Trump's new world order, this shifts those positions. What's changed about our government's role?
My sense is that Canada is still figuring out what's changed and how we react to that. But it's true that in the post-world order, Canada's role internationally has long been governed by, to some extent, its relationship to the United States, which might be kind of like our big brother. It's like we don't, in the world stage. And I know a lot of Canadians will flinch at hearing that, because there's a certain pride, independence, and whatnot that as a Canadian, also feel. But in the international world, the United States is our closest ally. It's been our best friend in the world and our partner in most things. One expert said to me, Canada is in the G7 because the United States wanted us there. We were not, at the time, one of the largest 7 economies in the world. We still are not. But we've been sort of their pal. And often when the United States is belligerent, we understand them well enough and we have a close enough relationship that we can talk them down. But also we understand them well enough that we can be that diplomatic peacemaker and sort of go and say, okay, this is what's really important to our friends in the US. How can you meet them halfway? What can we tell them you're going to do? So when we get cut out, there's a whole different way of you have to approach that. Now, one thing that Canada has been doing, this is something that a lot of the people I've spoken to have emphasized, that a lot of the specific complaints that Trump raises, rather than sort of the general tone or the approach to negotiating or in trying to enforce its will, the specific complaints often are justified and sometimes are longstanding things in the U.S. foreign policy community. Some complaints about how the World Trade Organization operates, about the administration of the World Health Organization, about funding for NATO. He didn't invent these things, right? And in many cases, even Canadian scholars that I talk to say, the World Trade Organization, for example, needs updates and revisions. It needs to be made to work for the 21st century. And so part of what Canada's been doing is taking the initiative to try and update those institutions, with other partners in Europe and elsewhere, maybe to placate some of the US's angry complaints. Chris Sands at the Wilson Center here in Washington said he doesn't know if there's an appetite in Canada, certainly not among the Canadian people, but maybe also not among the government. But there is a good cop, bad cop role that potentially could still be played, or being a Robin to, the way he phrased it was Robin to the United States' Batman.
We'll be right back. I love that. I'm a superhero guy, so I did love that metaphor. But I think this is one of the things, though, because of the way that he reacts, I think nothing's off the table. Some of these experts actually said, what if he does something crazy enough that there is a potential military action up in our north? I think they were saying this to you. This is a crazy thing, but in this new world order, it's not that crazy because who knows what can happen. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I mean, he was putting it forward as a realistic possibility now 20, 30 years down the road. But that was Bob Bothwell, historian and foreign policy expert at the University of Toronto, who lived in Washington for a period of time and is really an expert on Canada's foreign policy and foreign interests. And he was saying essentially like China and Russia are both making claims to the Arctic. He said they're making them for a reason, that in a climate change world, the water that currently is in the Arctic is potentially very, very valuable, right? The rights to that water. And Canada claims sovereignty over much of its own north, right? We in Canada call it our own north. But Russia and China are both making claims on that. And he's saying if in 20 or 30 years, if our relationship with the United States and the United States' policy towards the world follows along the trajectory it is, imagining a Russian or a Chinese invasion of the Arctic, or, you know, given the population there and the state of Canada's defense capabilities, it would be less of a military invasion and more of just a marching in and taking over. Would we be able to depend on a U.S. led by Donald Trump or an ideological successor to defend us militarily? And he was saying, I don't think so. And what's Canada's other option there? You know, I was saying, you're talking about a war, and he was saying, might not even come to war, because if Russia sends their military into the Arctic, what is Canada going to do? What kind of war can we even mount realistically?
Actually, Ed, I've seen Red Dawn.
Wolverines!
So I think that we will be okay as long as we have a small pack of children who can defend us.
Right. But I'll just add the disclaimer that that's not a prediction, but he was raising it as a legitimate possibility that we would have considered absurd 10 years ago, and that it's hard to game out what it means for Canada if the current sort of trajectory of policies continue.
And this is just it. It is that topsy-turvy, and I think the chaos is obviously evident in this election. You are there. You just wrote about the conspiracy theories that are flying around.
Let me ask you about QAnon. It is this theory that Democrats are a satanic pedophile ring and that you are the savior of that.
What are some of the craziest things that you've heard from real people? And also, how does this country move forward if they can't really agree on a set of facts?
The second question there is really difficult. The first question is that I haven't heard things that are crazier than what you find on Twitter or crazier than what many of our listeners who are interested in this will have already heard. But especially if you go to the lineups outside Trump rallies and whatnot, or even if you just approach hardcore Trump supporters on the street in a lot of towns, you do hear elements of the QAnon conspiracy theory. This is, just to be frank, it's entirely baseless, right? It's been well covered. But also I hear, and this is on a different tack, I do hear quite a lot about fears from Trump supporters and even sort of like, you know, not hardcore, but people who say they're voting for Trump, about a socialist takeover of the government, about what's happening in cities and the chaos and violence in parts of the Midwestern heartland among rural Americans. There is an impression that cities like New York and Philadelphia and Portland are just post-apocalyptic nightmare right now, burning to the ground with violent clashes in the streets. That's just not the case. There has been some isolated rioting. There has been clashes with the police, most of them involving the police sort of tear gassing and beating protesters who sometimes are throwing rocks at them or things like that. You walk 5 minutes down the road in those cities and it's business as usual. It's still people sitting on a patio drinking coffee or whatever, right? Going to their offices in their day-to-day public lives. And so there's a perception among those people that there's a civil war coming and that it's already being fought in big Democrat-controlled cities that are running wild and out of control. That's just not the case. And Donald Trump does give that impression a lot. Moving on, though, I would say that this question of how the United States move forward when they can't even agree on common premises, when they have entirely separate and not overlapping views of what the reality of the world's situation is right now. It's something that actually, like, in different ways, people who've told me they're supporting Donald Trump and people who've told me they're supporting Joe Biden have both expressed. Like, they just say, politics has become so extreme. The extremists in both parties have taken over. I don't know how we're even going to ever come together. I don't know how we're even going to have a civil discussion anymore. It might start, and maybe there's a top-down. I'm a big supporter as a Toronto guy, and I cover politics and wrote a children's book about politics. I'm a big supporter of grassroots solutions. But the current bitter polarization in the United States, there might be a big role for the leadership, the political leadership actually here, if they're interested in playing it. I was looking at a survey the other day, and I wish I had the citation handy, and I just can't remember the organization that conducted it. But one of the top line observations was that Americans don't disagree any more than they did in the past. If you're asking them about various issues and charged issues like gun control and abortion and whatnot, they're not more polarized ideologically, but they dislike each other more intensely. They have a view that the people that they disagree with have become more extreme, right? And that exists on both sides, that view. And it may be because both in the media environment, things like Fox News and the more independent outlets to the right of that, and potentially some of the reaction to that on the left, especially on social media, the most vocal elements of each side have become so loud and so persistent and so far at the extreme ends. The extreme ends of the spectrum have become such outsized voices. And particularly in like the Republican Party, they've been channeled right into the leadership of the party, so that you have members of Congress and the Senate and even the president sort of giving credence to the wildest conspiracy theories or the more extreme voices on the spectrum. That's created this widespread reality where people believe that politics has become so extreme when the mainstream of public opinion, the vast bulk of people, don't exist at those extremes. My understanding of it is not a case where if you walk door to door, you find neighbors who view the world so entirely differently that they'd be willing to go to war with each other. They agree on actually quite a lot, and the things they disagree on, they have relatively moderate positions, and the same kind of positions that Americans had 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, or the same kind of differences. And yet they turn on their television or open Twitter or watch congressional speeches, and they get the impression it's two teams, and you have to choose which brand of absolute lunacy you want to support, because there's no in between. And so maybe political leadership potentially could be offering that middle ground olive branch. And Joe Biden on the left side is certainly an example of attempting to do just that. The Democratic strategy in this election was, let's pick the most moderate milquetoast centrist that we can find that's in the race and promise we're not going to turn over any more apple carts for a while so everybody can take a deep breath, right? But I just finished by saying that the Republicans like Mitt Romney in Utah and Larry Hogan in Maryland, who have been trying to play that role in the Republican Party, have become less celebrated because of it.
I know we talked a lot about chaos, but I think there was a hopeful note in there, and that hopefully Americans, like I said, are not that divided, and we're going to find out in 2 weeks where they all stand. Ed, I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you. And I hope we find out in 2 weeks, because my kids would like to see me. It could extend beyond that, but Election Day certainly will tell us where we're going next.
Well, that's one part of the chaos. I hope we don't know whether he does drag it off who wins, but that's another story for another day. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, right after the election. Ed, thank you so much.
Raju, thank you.
Edward Keenan is the Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.